Is this working? Come on, is this working? Why aren't you working? Alright. Okay. I believe I'm recording. One moment while I get my headphones. Alright, let me just see if the audio is working here. Is the audio working? I am not hearing anything. Okay, there's a delay. That's fine. I will get started then. Hello, and welcome to Under Construction. I'm Nathan Curtis, and once again, I'm going to be talking about how to construct some puzzles. And this week, I've decided to do Hex Pathfinder. After initially wanting to do something about hex puzzles in general, I'm going to focus instead on one of my favorite types, the Hex Pathfinder. And if you have been a regular solver of Tortoiseshell Studio, of my puzzles at Tortoiseshell Studio, you'll know that I do a lot of Pathfinders and I do a lot of hexagonal Pathfinders. It's sort of become one of my go-to types. And if I have a trademark, it is A, turning crossword variants into hexagonal grids, ones that were on square grids, making them hexagonal, and 2, doing this in particular with Pathfinders. So I originally tried 2 weeks ago to do one on hex puzzles in general, but had some problems with the video setup. I apologize for that. I am going ahead with it today with Hex Pathfinder. So I'm going to start with the presentation. And, first I've got to switch the video over here. All right, now I'll start the presentation. No, before I do that, I need to fix the video again. Thought I had done this once already. Apparently I just get to keep fixing things as they come up. Alright, let me make sure that this will fit in when I go full screen, and I will start the presentation. Now I swear. Alright, so I'm going to be talking this week about Hex Pathfinder, my second try at doing episode 7. So Hex Pathfinder, excuse me, as I said, is a variant that I do a lot. And it looks a little something like this. This is what the blank grid for a hex pathfinder might look like. And you're going to fill the grid with letters, and a filled grid looks a bit like this. And it may be hard to make sense of this one because, unlike a lot of common variety formats, there's nothing is sort of set in stone at the beginning. It's not like a marching bands where you have 2 entries reading across each row and you can just spot those right away, or like a rose garden where you have little blooms that some of the entries will just go around. Entries can go any which way, so looking at this, it's not really obvious where the words are. But each of the entries will start somewhere in this grid and will follow some sort of winding path. So I have a few examples highlighted. Starting in the upper left, in the red letters, is equilateral triangle that winds its way around. Another one that overlaps with that is tequila sunrise in the green letters, which may be a little bit hard to see in this contrast, I'm not sure, but it starts just below the E in equilateral triangle and curls up a little bit, overlapping a bit with the EQUILA. A third one that overlaps both of those answers a little bit is Mount Rainier in the blue. So that's some examples of how the entries are found in a hex pathfinder. So with that, after that illustration, let me talk a little bit more about what a hex pathfinder is in more textually. So it's a hexagonal variant of the Pathfinder puzzle type, which is usually done on a square grid. The Pathfinder puzzle type itself, I know that it has appeared in Games Magazine going at least back to the early 1990s. I have a collection of puzzles from Games Magazine that includes a Pathfinder, and the collection is from the early 90s. That particular puzzle was written by Mike Schenk, and I would not be surprised if he devised this variant, given how many other variety formats he has created over the years. But I am not 100% sure on that. I would like to go and perhaps contact Mike Schenk directly and ask if he knows, but I was not able to do that in time for this stream. The hexagonal variant, maybe other people had come up with the idea, but I independently came up with it in 2013. It was the first time that I wrote a hexagonal pathfinder. I think I had been doing I had been doing pathfinders for a year or two, and I'd been doing some other hex variants, and I decided to try a hex pathfinder. It worked out pretty well for me. So in a hexagonal pathfinder, or a regular pathfinder, if you want to be more general, you have a grid of hexagons. Originally it would be a square grid, and you have a regularly spaced pattern of black cells. In a square pathfinder, the black cells actually have to have this sort of staggered pattern, or they traditionally have a staggered pattern in order to break up some of the sort of long corridors of white squares that you would otherwise get. I will get in a little bit, I don't have it on the presentation, but I will talk a little bit about the differences between a hex pathfinder and a square pathfinder in a little bit. And one of the things is the grid pattern is a little bit more natural. There are many reasons why I like hex pathfinders, not just the aesthetics of a hexagonal grid. For solving, you're given the starting position and the starting direction of each entry, usually. There are some other ways you can do that. I have a puzzle that I am working on for a particular venue where I'm given the starting position and the ending position, but not the starting direction. And you're also given the lengths of each entry usually, so you have both an idea of what the entry might be and some more clues about placement. The entries will twist around the grid. You don't want to have an entry that just goes straight. Every letter will be used twice. Occasionally, usually there's the assumption that this means that the letter appears in 2 different entries. Sometimes I have used the geometry of the grid to have something where some of the entries will curl around and intersect themselves for the checking. Usually, if I'm using that as a mechanic, that I will have some sort of hidden message, possibly using those letters that appear twice in a single word. And so I'm just going to jump in and talk about making a hex pathfinder. So first of all, you're going to need hexagonal grids. And you need hexagonal grids for two purposes, and the two different purposes will influence what you use to make them. One is that you're going to need a grid for drafting the puzzle, for figuring out where to put the letters. Usually I do this on paper, with pencil and paper, and so in order to do that, you will want to have hexagonal graph paper. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. You can order custom notebooks. You will almost certainly not be able to find hexagonal graph paper notebooks in a brick and mortar store. I have gone to several stationery stores in the Boston area. None of them had hexagonal graph paper. Eventually I ordered both hexagonal graph paper and triangular or isometric graph paper off of a vendor online. But there are some issues with doing this online. You need to be careful about the grid size. When I ordered my hexagonal notebooks, it's the particular book that I ordered, it said it had the hexagons were 1/4 of an inch. And I, in my mathematical sort of point of view, thought this meant that the hexagons were 1/4 of an inch on each side. And that would be, since I'm used to using square graph paper that is 1/4 of an inch squares on each side, 1/4 of an inch hexagon on a side is much larger, and so that would be just fine for me being able to fit in the letters. But no, this was 1/4 of an inch wide, and that made it actually slightly smaller than a 1/4 inch a 1/4 inch square would be, and the shape of the hexagon also made it a little weirder. So I'm able to make it fit because I can scrunch my handwriting a little bit, but it can sometimes get messy when I have to erase a lot, and I wouldn't have preferred to do it that way. Another thing you need to be careful about if you're ordering a hexagonal graph paper notebook is the grid orientation. Often in many hexagonal puzzles, it's not as big of an issue for Pathfinder, but it is for other puzzles like hexagonal marching bands and such. You will probably want to make sure that your hexagons, the small hexagons, are in the correct orientation. For squares, the assumption is that it's just going to be oriented with horizontal rows and vertical columns. In a hexagonal grid, you don't have both rows and columns like that. You can have horizontal rows, but then the verticals will not be columns. They'll be staggered, and so you would have diagonals in other two directions. You could have, or if you chose to have vertical columns lined up, then the rows would be in, you wouldn't have unbroken rows. And so this can be important then, where if you have a pre-printed grid and you want to write a puzzle which relies on the opposite orientation, you'll have to turn your paper 90 degrees, which is sometimes not a big deal, but sometimes it's just, it's annoying. It's an extra step to have to do. So pretty much all of the hexagonal graph paper notebooks that I've had, and also many of the triangular notebooks, tend to be oriented 90 degrees off from what I would actually like. So another alternative to having graph paper, to ordering a notebook, is to print custom graph paper. There are websites online that will allow you to say, you know, I would like some hexagonal graph paper with a grid this size, and they will then give you a PDF to download and print. That's pretty fine. It's easier to check the size and the orientation. It means you're printing a lot, which might be an expense. It's usually can often be cheaper to just buy something from another printer, since they probably have a more cost-effective way of printing than your home printer. The other thing that you could do, that I would recommend doing anyway, is making a custom spreadsheet. And you might look at this and say, what? A hexagonal spreadsheet? This makes no sense to me. Spreadsheets are on rectangular grids, and there's not much you can do to get away from that. And the answer is that you can take cells in a spreadsheet and merge adjacent cells in a staggered pattern. it will look kind of like a brick wall. And although these do not look like hexagons, it does preserve the adjacent cells. And for something, especially for something like a hexagonal pathfinder, where the only thing you're concerned about really is what cells are adjacent to each other, then this is perfect. And even for ones where the hexagonal shape is kind of important aesthetically, for the purposes of filling the grid, this is just fine. You can go back and look at, if you're going to be publishing it anyway, you're probably going to be making a separate grid, and that will be the next thing that I talk about for the puzzle itself for solvers. But for creating the puzzle, this should not be a huge concern, unless there is something about having the precise geometric measurements correct. That shouldn't be an issue. So if we then go on to consider the question of how do we do hexagonal grids for puzzle layout, so I'm assuming that you're using some kind of graphics program. I use Inkscape, which is open source. You can also use a proprietary tool like Adobe Illustrator and so forth. And you generally want to be using a vector graphics program for this. And so the procedure that I use in Inkscape is I will create an axonometric grid overlay. This is sometimes called an isometric grid, but for Inkscape, the axonometric means that you can sort of change the different angles of it. But in this case, you probably just want to use the default angles. It will usually tell you something like 30 degrees for both X and Z. Don't worry too much about that. You may want to adjust the spacing of the grid, which is there's usually one value for that, and that tells you how far apart the grid lines are. And this is a grid overlay that is only appearing as a guide when you are creating the image. It will not be included in the image itself when you save it. So you create this overlay, and then there is a polygon/star tool. You can use it to create one hexagon. And you want to make sure that it is oriented in the direction that you want. Excuse me, though again, it's not as important for pathfinders particularly. It is useful to make sure that that you have a pair of sides that is vertical. The polygon star tool in Inkscape, you first click on where you want the center of the polygon to be, and then you drag to a point that will be one of the vertices of the polygon, and then it will create all of the other symmetrically arranged vertices and create the segments and save that as a shape. And you can change the fill of it, you can change the edges in terms of color and transparency and whatnot. So once you've created that one hexagon, it would be really tedious to have to do that over and over, so we won't. There is a tool in Inkscape that will let you create tiled clones, which will let you make a grid of hexagons. The create tiled clones is in the edit menu. If you do this, the grid is usually going to be scaled to the size of the object that you are trying to clone. But there are some issues if you have an object that is not rectangular, such as a hexagon, and we'll see this when I do an illustration of this live after the presentation. And so in order to fix this, you will need to shift the position in each row to make the grid correctly aligned. And I forgot to put the amounts in here, but the shifted positions will basically be in our case, the X position will be shifted by 50% for each row. The Y position will be shifted by -25% for each row. And this will make the hexagons properly aligned. They'll fit together instead of being kind of jagged, jutting out from each other. And then you want to unlink the clones after you've made the grid. This is because when you create tiled clones, they're all basically copies of the very first object that you made. And so if you make any changes to that first object, all of the others will change. For instance, if you change the color of the shading, if you made it a red hexagon, then everything else would become a red hexagon as well. Additionally, if you tried changing any of the copies, they would not change unless you had also changed the original. So you need to unlink the clones, which makes them independent objects again. And then you're going to delete hexagons outside the desired grid shape, because the grid of tiled clones is by default in a rectangular grid. If you use the shifting to make it properly aligned, it will be a parallelogram shaped grid. But if you want a hexagonal, the hexagons to form a larger hexagon, you'll probably want to delete some of them in a particular pattern. And you're going to want to shade the hexagons in the desired pattern, and we'll talk about what the desired patterns will be. If you're using a rectangular grid overlay, the x-axis spacing should be 0.866 times y-axis spacing. You might want to use a rectangular grid overlay, usually in addition to the axonometric, because you can sort of click back and forth, make one of them visible while the other one is hidden. You might want a rectangular grid overlay to more easily align things like text for grid labels, or for the entering the solution letters. And in this case, because they're hexagons, the ratio of the width of a hexagon to the height, so to speak, the distance between two opposite the ratio of the distance between two opposite sides and the distance between two opposite vertices is the square root of 3 to 2, and that is approximately 0.866 to 3 decimal places. So if you had, say, very simply, if you had, say, your grid spacing was 1/10 of an inch on the y-axis for your axonometric grid, because the axonometric grid is specified in terms of the y-axis, then when creating a rectangular grid, you would want to have that same 0.1 inches on the y spacing, but then 0.0866 inches on the x spacing. And so those are the steps for creating the hexagons that you will need to start drafting and to complete the puzzle. But the most important part is actually coming up with the entries that will go into this puzzle. So, we're going to start with a seed entry. And one of the really nice things that I like about Pathfinders compared to a lot of the other variety formats that I work with is that your seed entry can be just about anything. If you are doing a marching bands, that entry, if you want to put a marquee entry in row 1 or at the beginning of the first band, you have restrictions. It has to follow the wordplay, the overlapping wordplay of a marching bands. If it's in the first row, if it's in the beginning of the first row, it's got to, one of them has got to start, the band word has got to contain a row word at the beginning, or vice versa. And they have to be unrelated words. So there are a lot of seed entries that just don't work. In a Pathfinder, almost any seed entry will work. You might want to avoid something with really weird letters like Mr. Mixospitalik, but other than that, it's pretty much like picking a seed entry for a themeless crossword. If the letters are really weird, that might put you in a sticky situation as you try to fill around it. But otherwise, knock yourself out. And in comparison to a themeless crossword, in a form like Hex Pathfinder, you have no need to have the entries be of symmetrical lengths or symmetrical positioning, so pretty much anything will work out. So then you want to place that seed entry in the grid. I tend to start on the edge, and often starting in the upper left corner, so that my seed entry can be the first entry in the grid when solvers are doing it. Sometimes I wind up having to move it around a bit. Sometimes I will have an undefined border. Basically, I have started by shading in the repeating pattern of black squares, and I place an entry that will be somewhere in the puzzle, but I haven't set the outside borders of that grid yet. At some point, I will have to, as I start growing larger and realizing that, oh, if I go any further this way, I will be larger than the grid size that I want. So I will need to set the borders, at least in this particular axis, at this size. That works better for a square grid than for a hexagonal grid, since the square grid is sort of easier to move around. The sides are all parallel. There's the same number of squares in any row or any column, while a hexagon has the different rows of a hexagon are different sizes. So that's one place where square grids are easier to work with. You're going to want to choose a path for that seed entry, and you may want to allow for some flexibility in that maybe you know where you want it to begin and how it's going to start at the beginning of the entry. But if that entry is long enough, it's good to have the flexibility to change the end of the path if you realize that, oh, it's going to work much more nicely if it goes to the left instead of the right here. And then you need to add more entries. You're going to want to look for interesting overlaps with the existing entries. This is the thing that I like about most variety forms, is that they're based on overlaps instead of just single letter intersections as in a crossword, and hex pathfinders just have so many options for how those overlaps can go. You want to make sure that you use reverse overlaps periodically. I had in the sample grid that I showed you at the beginning, I had like two of the seeds were equilateral triangle and tequila sunrise, and those overlapped EQUILA in the same direction. But you would want to also make sure that elsewhere in the puzzle they had overlaps where the two entries were going in different directions in those overlaps. And there are ways to plan for that. It's just a lot more interesting if the overlaps are not always the same direction. And if you can find ways to have one entry that overlaps multiple entries that you've already placed in the grid, that is useful both for being cool looking, but also it sort of gets a lot of the letters that you need already removed, taken care of. So it gives you more flexibility for future entries. You're going to need to keep track of your progress as you go along. Whether you're working on paper or in a spreadsheet, this is very important. The Pathfinder is one of the trickiest puzzle types in terms of making sure that all of the checking is correct. If you are doing this in, say, a marching bands, it's pretty easy to check. Well, do I have 2 entries in this row? Yep. Do I have any missing letters or doubled letters in the bands? Nope. All right, then I'm fine. In a Pathfinder, you have to check. You have to make sure that every single square in the grid is properly checked. So the things that I try to track as I'm putting entries in, you want to note where each entry begins. If I am working on paper, what I will usually do is I will circle the starting letter of every entry where it appears in the grid. You want to keep track of your checked letters. And so the first time that I enter a word into the grid, into empty space, I'm just putting in the letters as is, maybe circling the first letter, as I said. If I'm putting another letter in, or another entry in, and it uses some of those letters, I'm not going to write that letter a second time, but I will usually put a tick mark in the corner of the box. Excuse me. Where that letter is. And those tick marks will remind me that I have already checked those letters. I do not need to use them again. It is especially important, though, that you need to update your progress if you wind up taking an entry out or changing it. This can mean that some of your checked letters are no longer checked because you have taken out one of the existing entries. You should also make sure that you update the starting letters, even if it's just you've decided to make an entry go the other way, because sometimes you could choose to have an overlap be the beginning of a word or the end of a word, but you want to get those taken care of. And as you're going along, you need to watch out for traps. In a Pathfinder, what this means is places where you might have isolated unchecked letters. And sometimes this means that you're going along and you've just missed out on a letter that you're like, okay, I'll be able to get this with cover this letter with an entry over in this area, and then you wind up putting some other entries in and you can't get to that letter anymore. Sometimes you wind up getting clusters of letters that you just cannot fully cover that cluster by single words of the right length, because usually you want to have words of at least 5 letters in one of these, mostly because if shorter words, you just can't have a good, interesting path for a 3 or 4 letter word, especially in a square grid. You're often restricted there. So I like to stick to words that are at least 5 letters. On the other hand, if a cluster needs to have words that are 7 letters or longer to fill it, and you've already got a lot of constraints from letters that are already there, you may find that you just can't find, you don't have enough freedom to find a word that will do what you need there. And so that's another thing to work out. This usually happens when you're around the grid edges. And I will talk a little bit about that as we go into the actual constructing process. You'll want to finish off usually around the edges. Sometimes you'll finish in the middle of the grid, but that's usually kind of risky to do just because there's the edges, since you can isolate some of the crossings, is easier. You might have to take out some entries and try again, and try positioning the entries differently. One thing that I don't have in the presentation here, and I'll be sure to bring it up as we are working on the construction of a grid, is that you should verify when you are done that you have correctly created a valid grid. And this is usually 2 steps. One of them is counting all the letters and making sure that that you have twice as many letters as blank spaces in the grid. And the other is just sort of going through and making sure that all of the, as you go through the entries, all of the letters are in fact accounted for. And if your count was wrong, figuring out what went wrong and fixing it. So let me move on then to, first I'm going to talk about making the grid for layout. Even though this is sort of the last step in the process for creating the puzzle, I'm going to do it first now. All right, so here I've got I've opened up a blank document to illustrate. So in document properties, let's just make it letter sized. So in the document properties window, I'm going to go to the grids tab, and I'm going to go to axonometric grid, create a new one. And so by default, the angles for X and Z are 30 degrees. You should not change those. Those are what you want. The spacing for the spacing for Y rather can be different. You probably don't want to change the origin for X and Y. But let's say we're working in inches. I usually want to have something like, maybe let's try for 0.3 inches. But in order to have some nice subdivisions, it's usually nice to have the major grid, to have whatever your grid size is for a single cell, that you have a smaller grid inside of that, so you can do things like find the center of a cell or find a point near the edge that is that is consistently some amount from the corner. So I'm going to put in, let's say, 0.0 0, 6, 2, 5, and then do a major grid line every 4. I like to, when I'm doing a hexagonal grid or using an axonometric grid, I want to have my major grid lines every 4 iterations. One reason is that this means you can evenly divide your side lengths in 2 easily, but also if you're using the major grid lines for the outer borders of things in an axonometric grid, the center will also be a vertex. We'll see this in a second as I get to actually making the grid. All right. So, and actually let me go and make the grid slightly larger just so that it is more visible for the purposes of illustration. I'm not actually using this to make a puzzle. So let me double this. Instead of a 1/16 of an inch, I will use an 1/8 of an inch. All right. Now I'm going to go to the stars and polygons tool, which is on the left-hand column. Currently, it's going to make a polygon that has blue fill. I don't think I want blue fill. Let's do a say aqua to begin with. Oops. That is a triangle. I do not want a triangle, but fortunately you can just change the number of corners. 4, 5, 6. And let me just go back and make that from the beginning. So I have the cursor here at a grid intersection. It's set up to snap to the grid intersections anyway. And then drag up here to another grid intersection. And I have this nice single hexagon. And now I'm going to go up to the edit menu, clone, create tiled clones. I don't want this to be huge. Let's say that we want to make a grid of hexagons that is 5 on a side. We do need to be a little bit careful here because that actually means that there are 9 rows in a hexagon that's 5 on a side. And the columns can be a little weird too. So to make a hexagon that's 5 on a side, I'll start with a 9 by 9 grid. So I've put in 9 rows, 9 columns. The tiled clones menu gives you the options to have different kinds of symmetry. You want to stick with P1 simple translation for this. Now, if we were to create this grid, you see that each of the rows is fine. It's hexagons going straight across each row, but they're arranged point to point in from one row to the next with all this empty white space between them. That's not what we actually want. So to make it work, undo that, go to Shift, and in this case, each row we want the hexagons to be to the right of the one previous, or to the left. It depends on which way you're sort of setting it up. But for now, let's assume that we want it to be to the right. We don't want it to be all the way to the right. The percentage here are based on the size of the original shape. And so if we want the next hexagon to be here, the X, the horizontal positioning, it is basically half a hexagon's width further to the right than the previous one. So we want this Shift X to be 50% per row. Per column, we don't need to adjust. It was getting the horizontal arrangement within a row just fine. We're not going to need to adjust that. Some grids we would have to adjust per column. Shift Y, in this case, if we zoom in on this, that's not what I wanted to do. If I go back to here and we zoom in and go find this again. So this will hopefully be clear. Let me zoom in a little bit more just to make the size of the grid clearer. So the height of one of these hexagons in the smaller grid size is 8 grid intervals. The vertical difference between the top of the top hexagon and the top of the second hexagon, if you sort of work your way down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it is even with the midpoint of the sort of wider segment here from the center of the hexagon to the bottom. So it is 6 grid intervals below the top of the first one. And since we said that the width of the whole hexagon was 8, it's 2 less than the whole width. That is 2 out of 8 is 25%. So we're going to want to go minus 25%. And so if we go here, take this, and with these settings, now we create the same 9x9 grid. Lo and behold, we have created a properly aligned grid of hexagons. Now, this is a parallelogram grid, not a grid of squares. We'll fix that in a second, but first, I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to go back to the Edit menu where I found the Create Tiled Clones, and I'm going to unlink the clones so that I can make changes to them individually. And I'm just going to go ahead and, if we wanted a hexagonal grid, the way to do this is to just delete the smaller hexagons that are outside the desired grid shape. So I'm going to delete out here. Sometimes you might want to set up something that allows you to just get a whole bunch at once and delete them, but since I've only got a 5x5 here, I'll just work with the individual hexagons here. Now you will see that this is sort of off of the size of the paper. So if we move out, there's the original paper. That's fine. We can go back to the document options page, and in the document properties, we can resize this page to the content. So we'll resize this page to drawing or selection, making sure that we don't select anything in it. Because if we were to select, say, a hexagon, it would resize the page to just be the size of one hexagon. If we resize to the selection, it has changed the margins and starting point of the canvas to be exactly the size of our grid. You'll notice that this grid that I've created, it's 7 inches wide. It's about 7 inches by 7 inches, roughly. And that's pretty big for a hexagon this size. We did not need to go this large, but this was an illustrative example, and hopefully you can figure out how to scale things with some trial and practice on your own. So if we want to actually make this into a grid of the type that we would want for a hexagonal pathfinder, we want a different shading. So first we'll take the whole grid and make everything white. In something like this, it might be that by the end I want the cells to have no fill, but to begin with I want them to have white fill because it's a lot easier to select cells that have white fill than to select cells that have no fill. And then I am going to just start making the cells black in the correct pattern. If it is 5 wide, the top row is just going to have a single black cell in the very middle. And we are going to want to have every third cell in each row be black, but in a staggered sort of way. If I had tried to move this over, it wouldn't be symmetrical. So for 5, we start in the middle. And then we do 2 in here. And I'm just going to select a bunch of these at one time to turn them all black. I'm just going through and selecting a whole bunch of these. and shading them in. And then if I were actually formatting this for a puzzle, I would also want to put in the grid labels, and I would want to put in text for the solutions, and I'd first of all want to create separate layers for those, but since this is it's good practice. So layer background hexes. If I then did, say, grid numbers, I might choose to put the numbers sort of in the top of each of these cells. Again, I'll zoom in. So maybe I want to have 1 there, and you want to make sure that it's in the right place. So first I want to make sure that each of these is centered. I like having them centered when I have a hexagonal grid. I want to make the size a bit bigger. Let's go for 12 points since these are big hexagons anyway. And so you might have 1 starting there, and 2. Oh, need to make sure that the settings got saved so that it doesn't have to reset. All right, now, no. 12. Try that again. 2. Okay. 3. And just to make sure that I picked a good size, let's go for a 2-digit number, 25. This is a decent size of grid labels. They might go a little bit larger, but you don't want them to be too big because you want the solvers to have enough space to write in the letters. And then you'd also want to have a layer for the solution. And so then in that layer, you want much bigger letters so you can read them. So maybe like 36 point. Is that a good size? That looks like a good size. You go A. Want it to be, no. I do want caps lock, actually. I do want to scream at this puzzle. And then you just start entering in the solution text. This can be tedious because it's 1 letter at a time. If you're good with software, if you're good with writing, with programming, you might be able to write yourself a template that will take a series of rows and enter them in properly. But I usually don't mind doing it 1 letter at a time like this. So that's the layout side. But for actually creating the puzzle, it would be really annoying to work this way. You could, in theory, create a grid like this and work within Inkscape or your graphics program of choice to enter letters in as you're constructing them. It's going to be really annoying. I don't want to do it that way. I'm going to use a spreadsheet. I normally do this on paper, but paper doesn't really work in this for the live stream. So let me pop over to here to my spreadsheet, and I am realizing that it's a little weird the way I'm doing this. All right. So let me walk through the steps of making a hexagonal spreadsheet for the purposes of puzzle creation. If we start here, I'm going to want to make this a little bit smaller. All right. So going back to this grid, I have currently emphasized all of the grid boundaries in this spreadsheet to illustrate what I am doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by selecting 2 adjacent, horizontally adjacent cells in this grid. And I am going to merge them. And they are now a single rectangle, as you can sort of see by the fact that these 2 grid, in the upper left, that the grid boundary has disappeared. And we could go through and just repeatedly do this, but that is going to get very tedious. And so what we can do is instead select this newly merged rectangle. In fact, we can undo this. Select this first merged rectangle, copy it, and then select, let's just do the most of this row, and paste. And what's that going? What? No. There is. It is doing something weird with the keyboard. I think maybe. I think maybe it is. Let me try that again. Huh. I am confused. Normally it will repeatedly paste that first one. I might have to do this. Oh, I see. I was using the wrong button. Right. I was not telling it to paste. I was telling it to repeat. All right. So if we take that first merged cell, copy it, and then paste, it has now created copies of that first merged rectangle along this row. And for the row below it, we want to have the same set of merged rectangles, but we want it to be staggered. We want it to be shifted over one. So we'll do the same thing of selecting a lot of this, but we'll start one to the right of the previous row. Do that, and you see now we have these two adjacent rows that start to look like a brick wall. And now to do the rest of the grid, we'll select both of these, copy them, and just do a large copy paste, as large as we want our grid to be. Wrong way. And now, other than around the outsides of the grid where I left some untouched as sort of a buffer, we see that we have this nice brick wall of borders in here. And again, this is not actually hexagonally shaped, but it has all of the adjacencies of a hexagonal grid. And the rows are still going across, so if we wanted to do a hexagonal marching bands, Andrew, we could do it like this. If we wanted to do other hexagonal puzzles that use rows, we could use the same orientation. If we wanted a grid that was based on columns, we could basically undo this and do it where we were merging vertically adjacent cells instead of horizontally adjacent cells, and then copy the columns. Same principle. And then if we're actually going to get into making the puzzle, we want not just a large repeating grid of hexes, but we want to make an outline of that. So first, let's go ahead and eliminate all of these borders that we've drawn in. It takes a little bit of time because I have a huge selection there. So if we want, say, let's try to do, again, a hexagon that's 5 on a side. If we were to try to, one thing you have to be careful of once you've created this grid is selection, mass selection. If you try to do selections within a single row, just dragging back and forth, that's fine. If you once you start trying to select a region in more than one row, things will get a little bit weird. If I start here in just this one merged cell between L and M in row 2, and I drag it down, all of a sudden that whole row of both of those rows gets selected the entire way that I have merged cells, because it is, if once I drag down, it says, oh, well, I need to have everything that is below this merged cell, which includes both of the merged cells on either side of it in the next row. But then you have to be consistent about having the things that are above those. So it goes up to JK and NO and basically starts spewing out on both sides until you get to the end of this staggered pattern. And sometimes that's okay, but if you're trying to actually make the outline of a hexagonal grid, a finite outline, you don't want that. So you have to go in and do this one row at a time. So I've selected 5 hexagons on the top row. I'm going to add borders. 5 hexagons on the next, 6 hexagons on the next row. 7, 8, 9. Now at this point, that's our 5th row, so we can go back to shrinking to get back down to the bottom. So on the next page, I again have an example of this time a 7 a hexagonal grid that is 7 on a side. I'm going to use a 7 on a side hexagon for our sample puzzle. Normally, when I am making one, I will use an 8 by 8 hexagon, 8 on a side. This is just the size that I've usually gravitated towards. 7. I'm going to do 7 by 7 for this so that it's shorter and takes less time for me to fill. And I'll talk about what that size, what a difference the size makes in a second. But for a 7 by 7, again, we want to have the black hexagon pattern. We want a staggered pattern of every third hexagon in each row is darkened. And for this sort of thing, we usually want to have, you want to start with a grid, if you're doing it hexagonally, that is not a multiple of 3 on each side. Because you want to, if you have every third hexagon shaded and you are doing it symmetrically. Let me go back to the first page. So to the side of this hexagon, I'm going to show you a few possible ways to shade a row of hexes. So if we have, first let me do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we had this row of 5, similar to what we have on the top, and we're shading every third, and we want it to be symmetric. Well, if we had, if we started with this first one is shaded, then we have to go to the fourth next. So that's not symmetric. And similarly, if we started with the second, then we have to go to the fifth. So that doesn't work. So to make this symmetric, we have to go and start in the third. And if we were doing this 7, shading this in a border, we would have to, you can figure out that the way to make it symmetric is to do the first, fourth, and 7th. If we're instead have a row of 6, you can still make it symmetrical. That's not itself is not a problem. It's going to be the 2nd and 5th hexagons in that row that will be shaded. Nothing wrong with that. But this becomes a problem when we actually get to the grid. So let me undo all of that. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to make this grid just a bit larger. I'm going to shade it so that it is a 6 by 6 hexagon instead of 5 by 5. I realize that I shouldn't be saying 6 by 6 because it's not actually a square, but it's sort of ingrained habit sometimes that I think of grids in terms of rectangular dimensions, even if they're hexagons. All right, so here we have now a hexagon that is 6 on a side. And so if we go and do this, again, if we want it symmetrical, then the top row has got to be the 2nd and the 5th. And then we stagger this. And I'm not going to go the whole way through. I am going to shade the first few. But what has happened in here, if you look at the upper corners here, each of them is now only connected to one other blank hexagon. And that is not ideal. You want every hexagon, in general, every blank cell, to be adjacent to at least 2 other cells, usually 2 or 3. Now, one way that we can deal with this in a 6 by 6 is to say that we'll also shade in those outer corners. But that is going to wind up with what to me is a little bit jarring aesthetically, of having this repeated pattern that is broken on the outside. It is certainly better than having the cells on the outside be isolated, nearly isolated from the rest of the grid from a perspective of actually solving the puzzle, but I still think it looks a little bit suboptimal. So I don't like that. So I would rather have hexagons that are 5 on a side or 7 on a side, 8 on a side. I usually do 8 on a side for a typical size one. If I'm doing a bonus puzzle for something, I might go 10 on a side. So here we've got our 7 on a side hexagon, and again we want to do the 1st, 4th, and 7th, and we could go through and do this each row at a time. We could try to use copy pasting to make it faster, still tedious. Instead, I'm going to go on to the 3rd page where I'm actually going to show you where my workspace is. So step 1 in doing this is I've taken this hexagonal grid and I've added some conditional formatting. And I'm going to temporarily show the formatting so you can see what I've done. So first of all, the first formatting is if the text is exactly £, I am shading it dark. And I have in fact created in here, each of these dark cells has in it a £. And so I have then created the shaded grid by putting in equally spaced £. I often do this for black and white shaded grids on whether it's a crossword or a Pathfinder, something that will have black squares throughout the grid. It is often very useful for me to do it this way. It makes it easier to change the arrangement later if I realize that, oh, maybe I'm solving maybe I'm solving a crossword puzzle from Panda magazine, and I realize that I've accidentally got the shading wrong. I can easily change it by just copying and pasting the £, or whatever symbol I'm using to denote black squares. It's easier to shift over. The rest of these conditional formatting rules are for dealing with different conditions of the checking and basically keeping track of the progress. Are the entries checked? Do they begin words? And what I'm going to do is that if when I enter in a letter, actually let me also add in the formatting of having these be centered. So where is... I'm going to add in having them horizontally centered and also vertically centered. And I'm going to bump the font size up a bit. And I'm also going to make it bold so that it'll be easier to see when I'm actually entering letters. So if I'm just entering a letter in normally and I'm just putting it in for the first time, I'll just put it in like that, A, B, C, D. However, if I'm entering something and it is the first letter of the word, I'm going to put an exclamation mark at the end of it. And that word is now highlighted with red. It's not yet checked. I've only used it in the one word. So maybe to, I've got, instead of using arbitrary letters, let's just put in WORDS. And then if a letter then gets checked by another entry, I will add a period. So for example, in here, maybe I will add in frown up here. So I have an F, R with a period, O with a period, W, and I'm going to add a period here. So I still have this as a special color. It's yellow instead of green to indicate that it is still the first letter of a word, but now it's instead of being red, I know that it's been checked. And if I happen to use the same letter to begin two different words, for example, maybe I'll have Fundamental. Yeah, I have fundamental going over here. So now the double exclamation mark in F means that it has been the start of two different words, which means it's automatically checked. I could add in here an extra check of adding an alert color, something like bright red, if I accidentally have more than one period in a square. And this can be important if, say, I wind up changing some of the entries around, but I am currently going to rely on my own instincts to recognize that I should not put another word in a cell that is already shaded green or yellow or orange. If it's red, I can still put something in. So I'm going to back up. Because that was just an example, and start actually putting in a grid. All right. Clearing all of those letters, making sure that I don't get rid of the the pound signs for the black squares. I'm actually going to go down to 13 points because it was getting a bit big with the when I had exclamation marks in there. No, I said that I could have pretty much any seed entry, so I'm gonna often in a hex pathfinder I like to have words that are suggestive of hexagons somehow. For example, the example I showed with equilateral triangle, I believe I included something like 1/6 of a regular hexagon in a way, since a regular hexagon can be cut into 6 equilateral triangles. This time I'm just going to use under construction as my seed, since it is a legitimate phrase outside of my own endeavors. So if I go, like I said, I get to pick the path. Sometimes you have to be careful if it's a particularly long seed, and especially because I'm using a slightly shorter grid here, that you don't get yourself in too much of a bind with just the very first entry. But I'm not going to be too worried yet. If I need to change the end of this to get around something, I can do that. Let's go down here, maybe. There. So I have my first entry under construction. And now I want to find ways to add other things to overlap it. One thing that I like here, I want to find some ways to make this work backwards. I have CURTS here. I could branch over here, instead of going through the S, could put in Curtis, but I don't feel like being that vain this time. I will instead put in, let's try for curtsy. Oops, I need to make sure, since that is not only the first letter but also checked, that I indicate both of them. R, T, S, and here I have to go like that. Have to go that way. And there are a few different ways that I could then go here. Excuse me. I was thinking of maybe having something using CRE over here, possibly CRED, like credit card. Why don't I try that? So again, I've set it up so that I could do either period exclamation point or exclamation point period. This time D is going to go out this way. I'll hug the outside of the grid here. That's going to be a little bit easier, I think. Although I'm now seeing that I might have some issues in getting the overlaps to work out here. This ACT is very nice for something like active, but if I put in active, now over here I have this, oops, that V is not checked. Over on the right side, I now have this RD hanging out, and that R is only connected to the D now. I can't use the A, it's already checked. And so you would have to be very careful. It's either got to begin with RD or end with DR, and that's not great. But there's still some options I could use. For example, rated R. And in fact, I will do that here. The first, and that now checks the D and the R. And right away, I see that I've now set myself up to be able to have another nice overlap in here of something like vegetable. Could just do Vegeta if I thought that enough of my solvers knew Dragon Ball Z, but since I don't really know Dragon Ball Z myself, I only know that it's a character, I'm not going to do that. Actually, what I could do, though, is vegetarian using the AR. So A, still having the be start and checked. And yeah, let's stay around the outside of the grid there. If I'm just excuse me. If I'm still sticking around the right side of the grid, I want to be careful here with my G and the ON. I could have a word that uses both the G and the ON. Or I could make sure that I have a word that goes into the ON and a separate one going into the G to get the square that's that connects both the G and the O used twice. But I'm most concerned about getting that G used, because if I'm not careful, it will get cut off, and that's bad. If I wanted to connect it to the ON, I want to get as far as I can without having to look things up on COT or another tool. So I'm just sort of going out of my head. So things that go G blank ON, I could just have, well, there's goon. I don't want something that short. I could have goons plural. I could have goon squad, which I like for the Q. I could have Gronk. I can't remember if Gronk is even still playing. Despite the fact that I live in Boston, I should know this. That's Rob Gronkowski. I could still have Gronkowski, but I don't like using. I'm kind of skittish about using sports figures who are not current and not yet established as being, Hall of Fame level. So maybe I'll just tentatively put in Goon Squad. It's nice. I've got that Q. Qs. Everyone loves Qs, right? Well, constructors don't like Qs, but solvers like Qs. Surely. Actually, I see. I'm going to try something. See if it works. Gonna get into here. So what I want to try to do, and I might wind up being thwarted in this because I now is have this QU. Now I have the O needs to be covered, but I'm hoping that I can fit Banquo in. But then if I do that, if I just pick a place to put Banquo, let's go here to avoid cutting other things off. If I were to do that, B-A-N, Q is now checked, U is checked, O is checked. Now I'm in a position of having to get to the letters over here, and I have, in order to get this chunk of letters over here that currently says ADN checked, I have two options. I could either have that be the start or end of a word. ADN, if it were AIDAN, I could do like Aiden Quinn, but I don't know of anybody named Adian. And it could be the end of something. Again, not terribly likely unless I had if I allowed 4-letter words, I could just have Aida here, A-I-D-A, but I want to stick with 5-letter words or longer. Or I could have something that starts with A, D, and continues on, possibly through this and A here, possibly going in a different direction entirely. And then something else using this using the NAI or IAN. It could be somebody named Ian. That's fine. There's lots of Ians. But either way, I would need to be careful that I don't set myself up for an unfillable crossing later. I think I will, at least for now, try to continue with what I have. I don't think I can find something with ADIAN, but I'll think about Ians. What are Ians that I know? Ian McKellen, Ian Holm, Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming has some interesting letters for possibly having overlaps where with the positioning that I have for both Banquo and all of the other things around here. I need to be careful about whether the AD word and the Ian word overlap. It's better for me if I can have the entries for AD curve away from where Ian would have to go. That does mean that I have to have AD sort of has to go to the left through the NA, and there's no good way to reposition Banquo in this case without creating some other problems. For instance, if I instead had Banquo if Banquo starting up here instead, then this letter here is going to be cut off because anything that goes through there has got to also go through that B. Then that B is double checked, so I can't get a second word through that B. So that's impossible. I would have to keep the B here. I could try to move, if instead I had Banquo going here and here, then I would need to, again, I could have something like Canada or Grenada over with the NADA, but then I would have to make sure that my Ian begins with, his last name begins with a B. I could go the other way and have something with BNAI, although Benai Barith is well known enough to be an entry. Benai on itself is too short for a Pathfinder. So I wouldn't want this positioning. So if I am sticking with that, I would have to have, the only way that Banquo can go is this way. It may be that having Banquo here is not going to be feasible. We'll see. So any other Ian, I could also, in this case, on this side of things with Ian, instead of it being, somebody named Ian, that it goes the other way and ends in NAI, like Sinai, Mount Sinai, or Adonai. If we do something like Sinai, that's going to be what I would then be worried about there is, and even if I had something else here, I am still worried about getting this AD going through the NA, and then it has to be either has to end at that A, it has to use the B, or it has to go 2 letters longer, or 3, to get these 2 letters next to the S. And could have Granada as, it's not how the country is spelled, but there is I believe there is a city in Spain with Granada with this spelling of Granaada. But I don't think, then I'm going to have SGR over here. It's just going to, my problems are going to compound. So I suspect that I need to back up and take out Goon Squad and Banquo. Alas, and that makes G is still not yet checked. So I could, and also the O and the N here are no longer checked. So I could try to go through and come up with something else to go in here. Could be something like go on a date or something like that, but I'm not sure that I want to go that route. I could try to do something that ends NO blank G. I know there's something called Scuppernong. I don't know what the hell that means. I'm not going to use it since I don't know what it means. I think it will make most sense for me to have something that uses this G and goes in a different direction, does not overlap with the ON, but then something else does. So maybe it is something that ends in ING, and if I've got with what I already have here, I don't think that that there's a good thing that will have the NAI and then 2 letters and an ING. Maybe I could have gotten something that's a 2-word phrase that ends in G that overlaps with it, but I'm not going to spend that much time trying to find such a thing. So if it's just ING, what might I want to overlap with it? Let's see, I've already used triangle in the just thinking about what can overlap with the IAN. I've already used triangle in the example puzzle, so maybe something else for that. But maybe let's try. I have something in mind here. If I try something like selling, not as much of an interesting word as some of the ones I've already put in here. The G is now in. Actually, no. So then what I could do is also have S start snail here. Gonna do that. Not everything can be an exciting word. And then this E is kind of in a precarious position. And as so, I also have to be careful about this N here, because if I tried to go up from this L, it's got to go LI. If I try going up to LIN, then it's got to go ON as well, and there's nothing really that works there. Neither is the beginning or the end. I could start at the LI and curve around this way. I think what I'm going to be happiest with is maybe if I have something that starts at this NON, because non is a good prefix, and then 4 letters after it ending in E. It seems like there should be something that works for that. Let me open up cot. See if I have a good non-word there. Non-com, non-op, non-uple. Those are not good words. And nothing good backwards, so maybe it's not going to be non that. Actually, yeah, I think even though I don't like having that many 5-letter words clustered together, I like to, in the center, have longer words because I'm going to need to use lots of 5-letter words to get things to work on the edges. But I'll start with, oops, this is going to be both first letter and checked. If I try email here, and then I can fit, oops, first letter, crow, magnon, and again I have this unchecked G hanging over. That's fine. And I see this OR here, so I'm going to make use of that G and OR. G, oh, no. First letter and checked, and put in gate, tor, a, and I don't want the D to go to the left, since that's again going to cut off the letters around the C. Or sorry, I don't want it to go to the right, because that will cut things off to the C. So I want it to go up this way. And we are going to, again, have some concerns about isolated letters in this southeast corner. So that's going to be something that we need to figure out right away. I am really sorry for all this coughing. So I think what we are going to want to have is a 6-letter word here that either starts with this C or ends with that C. And starting with the C is obviously easier. C is a pretty limiting letter to end with. You know, we can have stuff like mosaic. And because it's harder to end with, I'm curious about trying to get it to end with that C instead of beginning with it. But the other thing that it's going to have to do is I'm gonna want it to overlap with, say, this have another word that will overlap with the AD, and then this other part overlapping with this E. That last part, having 2 letters that overlap with an E in a word, is pretty easy. But having these 3 letters that will properly overlap with AD and something else optionally is going to be harder. So I think at this point I'm going to take a look at cot. So again, I want it to be 6 letters total, but the relevant parts, so the overlap is 3 letters. I want 2 letters followed by that 3-letter overlap followed by C. I want that to be a word. Then going backwards, I want that the reverse of that followed by AD followed by 1 or more letters to also be a word. Let me see if I come up with anything good for this. And thinking. I am surprised it's taking this long. So far, those are not good answers. Maybe something like Gallic and ill-advised, although ill-advised is pretty long and possibly itself ill-advised. If I go back here, if I had yeah, we don't want ill-advised because we need, that's going to put ATVI here. So maybe I'll go back to having something starting with the C. Another possibility is that that we have a word that has the DA and 3 letters and then the C, and then try to fill in the 2 letters here. And that then the more probably don't need to do really a double search. Let's see. Didactic is not a bad word. Pedantic. The didactic or pedantic might work. There's the issue of the first 2 letters having to go with the TA. So if it was didactic, it would have to be something ending in DITA, which seems reasonable, or something ending in PETA. I think there's not much for PETA, since again, PETA is too short. Yeah, 2 words that I don't like. Dita, perdita. Is perdita something that I would want to use? Is it actually a... I don't know why it autocorrected to Perdita Weeks. Welsh actress who is in... I didn't even know that Magnum P.I. was being rebooted. That's how tuned into pop culture I am. Well, are there other people named Perdita? Not that she is necessarily... oh, she's a character in The Winter's Tale. That's what I was probably thinking of. Question, though, if I look for Perdita Weeks, how well known is she? I don't know why you decided to undo that. Perdita Weeks. Also in Reader Player 1. No, that's not... Only about 300,000 hits. That is not well known enough for me, so I'm not going to go that way. But looks like I'm going to have something that's probably that starts with the C. Although there is also the possibility that if I had, say, instead of having ill-advised, if I had Gallic here as an example, that I have something that something else that ends DALLI. So I'll take a look at that. Backing up. So again, I'm surprised given that there's only one variable in here that it is taking caught this long. Not that happy with any of those. All right, so I'll go back to C twiddle A dot dot star DA. One of the reasons why I was reluctant to have something beginning with C in this position is that it's right next to the S that is the start of two separate entries, and I just don't like clustering them up like that. I also have this E here, which is beginning an entry, and it just, again, both aesthetically and from a solving perspective, seems a little bit, it seems lopsided to me to have so many entries beginning in the same area, especially in the same space. But presumably Cot has given me some results. Okay, seller. Could have something about Vindaloo. Fandango. Oh, I have an idea there. I'm gonna see if something shouts at me first. All right. So it gave me as one thing that I liked was having here C O G N A C. And having something about Fandango, which would give me up here Fanta. Now I want to be careful because I've got that Fanta, and again, Fanta and Fandango would be starting at the same, and I really don't like it when they not only start with the same letter but go in the same direction. So I really don't want to have Fanta and Fandango. But if I were able to make this a little bit longer and use Grim Fandango, the question is, do people still know what Grim Fandango is? Ooh. It's being remastered? Huh. Maybe. I mean, it is kind of a cult classic. I'm feeling, you know what? This is my live stream. I'm gonna throw caution to the wind and see if I can use Grim Fandango instead of just Fandango. Grim Fandango, and then Fanta. So Fanta goes up there. Grim Fandango also uses the D, A, and then we overlap in the NGO of Cognac. And we now are in, do need to be a little careful because we're running out of room in this corner in the southwest, so maybe I'll just do some short words. Sella. And I also see that I'm putting myself in the same position as before of possibly having something like Gronk in the grid. And also having this, oh, yeah, now that I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that I'm going to have, again, problems of getting everything checked in there. So I am backing out Grim Fandangos. The problem is not that it's too obscure, it's that it's too long for that part of the grid. I might be able to rescue it if I moved the end of Under Construction around. Am I willing to do that? Will that actually help? if I did that, I would probably want to move the end of under construction up a little bit. Also, I'm worried about having this YE hanging out at the end, which is going to be something I, but feels possibly, again, something that might give me trouble. There's not a lot that I can do to move around that part of the word, though. So if I did put G up here, maybe. I am still not feeling good about my options for that. What if I tried putting RI down here? I couldn't use a cella, too short. So it would have to be ace, 3 letters start, or 6 letters starting with ace, or 6 letters ending with ECA. I think that, like, there's acedia, but I don't think I want that. Acetic, okay, I could use acetic if that works in the grid. Seneca I like much better. Oh, especially, yeah, Seneca works. So, I'm going to be making these noises for a while. If I had Seneca here, I could have risen going along with it. But if I did that, yeah. If I did this sort of thing, then I'm going to have the problem of getting the G and the M checked. In order for the M to be checked, then the space adjacent to the M, I can't get both the G and the M checked with 5-letter words or longer and get both of the adjacent spaces too. So I would have to, if I stick with Seneca there, I would have to do something other than risen. If I tried to do, say, shamisen to get the MI, then I'm still going to have the same problem. So I think that's not going to work. But if I had acetic instead of Seneca, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have even worse problems. All right. Yes. So my experiment with Fandango doesn't work. Gatorade. So I might back up and just try to be a little bit more modest in my attempts at fitting words into this area. Oh, these are going to be unchecked as well. Actually, I'm going to try. What is the name of the drink that cortado or cortada? Cortado. Okay, sure. Oh, I'm not above putting a trendy beverage in here. just thinking about things that can get that A, cover both the C and the AD. A, D, O. And then over here we could have something like something like atomic. Or maybe atonement. Don't want to go to I don't want to go to the right where it's going to rub up against the partial words here with tro, but I can go yeah, I can go this way instead. Maybe like this. No, that's not going to be long enough. Well, or it could just be atoned. I'm going to put metro over here. Oh. I'm confused by the appearance of that. Did that get... Huh. Looks like there's a... looks like these squares have gotten unmerged. Is that the case? Merge all? Okay, those two squares have gotten unmerged somehow. Weird. This does give me an EME. I could put retro instead of metro, and that might be easier to work with. Or atomic. So let me try MIC, and if I have retro here instead, and try for erector set. Might have some problems with again, with getting the overlaps to work. It's gonna be that's gonna be pretty tight there for erector set. So maybe not that specifically. If I tried going the other way here, then I have MISET is not a good start to a word. See, there's no. Could also be something like Dakota. Don't know why some of these have gotten unmerged. No. You are merged. You just had a line going through you. I don't really understand why some of these are merged but have lines through them. Toyota. Could be something other than retro or metro. Could be nitro. I think given these letters that... Why don't we try for the tones, and maybe just not thrilled with these possibilities. Metro. What ends in EME? Meme, but I want something longer than that. Let's see. Probably have more options if it's an R. Scheme. Eroteme, acateme. Morpheme. Theme. I apologize for my indecision here. Maybe there's a different ATO word. Not that that's the sticking point here. Atoll, atomic, at once, atone. Those are the main ones there. Any other TRO words that I'm not thinking of? Nope. Intro. Is intro? Intro might actually help. If I have something with EIN or... yeah, let's just stick with some short words around here. Atomic. And then I can have, over here, I can have... Oops. Niece. And then, all right, maybe Mirage. Dot. All right, that's a lot better than I was doing just a second ago. Might again have some concerns about getting out of this corner, especially with yeah, maybe, yeah, I think no matter what I do in this area, I'm again going to have issues getting all of the letters checked. So maybe I'll back out of Mirage and do something else. Not a single word that gets both the MI and the E, but a couple of words. Or possibly having okay, that's going to be a little bit weird, but I like it. All right, if I have something that's about 7 letters starting with MI, like let's see. Yeah, let me try. Okay. Oops. Again, gotta be checked. MICHAEL. And then down here we've got like EPOCH. And then POLE. EA. Now, I might play a little bit too much Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't know if either polearm or poleaxe are actually used that commonly. Polearm, 2 million. Okay, sure. Poleaxe, 622. Okay, polearm is reasonable. Poleaxe is somewhat. Although, yes, poleaxe is nice, even if it's not as well known, because I now have this nice exit, but I should make sure that I have the actual end of construction there. I think I think what I'm actually going to do to get to sort of gonna maybe move construction around, because I'm seeing some problems and possible solutions. So if I make it curtsied, past tense instead of just curtsy, then I now have more in place for I over here. Is that helpful? Maybe. This might be useful. Is there a good way to get... I still have this NU up at the top as well. So that is going to be... I should really get on that soon. I just really like having now the EYE, because the EY really wanted another E to spell I in some way. Just what is going to work for all of that? Maybe it is just curtsy, but I still have something with I around here. Really want red eye, but that's not going to be lined up correctly. You know what? Let's do... Will that work? Yeah. So at least as a start, I don't know what it's going to end this. I'll just put in nurse here. And now I have EYE. And so I want something that can go with I. Oh, but it's going to have a vowel at the start if it's going in that direction. Could happen. Let's see. L.EYE. Nothing in that direction. Oops, wrong. Not a, just a vowel. I tie. What's with these bad words? But maybe it's not. maybe it's not nurse. Maybe there's something else that I can get. Nudge. Nah. Okay. Yeah, I've really committed to having curtsy or curtsied. So making that not checked. Excuse me. Could be that there's something like eye drops that I can put over here. EYED star eye, just eye drop. I don't think that's gonna be great over here. I wonder if there's anything that I can get a little bit longer in that direction. E and a little bit and the UN. Overrun. Does overrun work in that direction? Maybe. Yeah, let's try that. So, no, not really. Alright, I'm gonna back up. I'm gonna try putting I, O, N here. It's tempting to put Brexit here, but that's just, then I'm gonna have the BR, and I've already had one case of having to put that in. So maybe it's just something like fire exit or exited. Exit. There's could use no exit, as in hell is other people. Maybe, but I think I'm gonna get again crunched up in trying to fill everything in that corner. Actually, what I can do, maybe it won't work, maybe it will, if I put under construction that way and pluralize poleaxe. No, and then I could have something here like exit exited exits exit row, maybe just exits, and then positioning is gonna get to be tough around here. Yeah, it's not, Don't know how well known that is. Oxeye Daisy. It's in Minecraft. Things that I'm learning today. Okay, there are plenty of oxeyes. So maybe I do oxeye to fill in over here. Ooh, 2 X's in close proximity is fun. And that gets me that YE that's been annoying me. Then I can have something with sex something. Well, if it were an H, I could have hexagons right there, which would be great. Don't think that I can get away with doing that. Maybe there's something. Okay, so no, it would have to be something that can go with both these. I'd want let's see, I'd want a vowel at that letter. Don't know if I can get that vowel, but I could also do something like apexes or ibexes. Alright, this might we're close enough that I think we can bring this home one way or another. This isn't going to be the cleanest fill in this area, but I'll go with apexes. Wrong one. That's still a black square. I suppose I could have... no. Not worth trying to make something work with sex. Don't quote me on that. Out of context. I could just have Snape here. And then I have this area over here, which could... there's certainly ways to make that work, but it would basically be an 8-letter word and a 6-letter word that are more or less overlapping. So I'd hope to get it a little bit more varied in this area. So I would need, in order to make this work though, I would need to have something ending in pans that's a little bit longer. So I'd need to have 1, 2, 3 e-pans. Pie pans is just too short. Fire pans, not a word that I like. Cake pans is definitely a word, but I don't... If I had cake pans, would that just as a K E P A N S, is that gonna work? Is there a way to get these countries to play nicely? I want to have something in here that will go with A, C, and K that isn't another cake. That's going to be unlikely. So maybe not that, but I did have some other could have been ibexes, which gives me a SNIBE. That's not good either. But maybe it is something that I can do with sex. Why don't I... So let's see. If I were to... This time I'm going to go to nutramatic instead of cot because it might be something that's not in Cot's dictionary. So let's see. If I am doing that, 2 letters, and then it's either going to be a vowel, could have an R, RNS, could possibly be a G. See if I got something there. Not really, other than sexier. And sexile, which, I mean, if you're in college, you know is a thing. But I don't think that's actually going to help me in terms of words, so maybe not. If I do it the other way, V, R, G, A, X, E, S. Apexes, ibexes, unixes. No, those are not great words. All right, so let's back up. So I had exits. We really want pole axes, singular EX. And we also have the YE. It might be, well, we also have this OIX, which can be the ending of some French words. So maybe there's some stuff that's gotten into English, like Mirepoix or LaCroix. LaCroix is certainly well known enough. So if I did that, how would that work? I think I would still think I may be, again, in the position of having too many entries all crunched up there to work out well. If instead of pole axes I had pole arms, I do have some problems there. Yeah, it's not a winning combination there. I still am just perhaps too tempted by something like Brexit or the like. I know being tempted by Brexit is also itself not a winning strategy for the long run, but it is just dangling there. Maybe I will just play around with moving some of these things around, and maybe I'll eventually get something that looks like I want to use. Oh yeah. Just need to get something with the I though. Is there anything that ends in star besides red eye, dead eye, naked eye? Okay, I am actually gonna back out. I might have been too eager with having a partial thing with Michael and Epic and Polax. So maybe I'll go back to that point and keep some of that in, but figure out a better continuation in here. So if I just search for that same set of things, I would have A equals 2. So Michael, M-I-A-B, and then I had another two-letter one. That was E-C-A. And then I had C, Twiddleby, star. see if I get anything else out of that. That looks good. Oops, that was not good. Minster, Mithras, mingled. Mindset, Eland, and latest is good. Let's see what I get on the longer side. How long do I want the last word to be? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So yes, it found poleaxe, mitered, emote. How do I feel about mitered? Probably willing to use it. Latescence is a little bit too out there. All right, let's try that. And I could. What if I did change the order of those two so that it's actually twiddle A, twiddle C, E. There's a lot more words ending in E than beginning in E. Well, that does turn Emong into gnome. It was giving me some results for that I wasn't thrilled with because of Emong. Yeah, let's go with, let's see how that is. So that's some letters I like. Mingled, gnome. So, mingled, gnome, N, oops, and dot, O-M-E, and then M-O, and now we have model, which could really go as long as I wanted. So let's maybe have under construction and model what? Yeah, Model T, modeling, modeled. There's a lot of possibilities there. That's a question. What is the preferred? I'm always bad about figuring out when I'm supposed to double the L in a in the past tense of an unstressed word, unstressed syllable. In American English, it's a single L, so probably don't want it to be like that. Model. Be nice to have 3 letters there. modeling, but modeling is not what I really want to have there. No, let's just stick with Model T. Because then I can have something over here like Titan. Yeah, let's do something like that. So how do I want that to interact with the EY? Okay, I don't want it to be Stitch. I want it to no, that's gonna. I'm just sort of going over different possible ways to make these words curve around and crossing some of them off in my head. So I think I still need to make the I go upwards, which could be annoying. Unless I have something, some other way of arranging words over here. Multi under construction. If I move the N up, then and title, yeah, it's the EY is still going to have to go upwards. But maybe I could have something again with like oxi and then again it could just be model over here or models. So what if it is, yeah, let's go ahead and try oxi. And maybe it's just model down there, maybe it's longer. Okay, and then I need to have something that goes through here and has the S or a different letter there. But I think we're going to be much happiest with an S there. STI. So if it is some kind of oh, actually, let's try T-Rexes. Oh, no, could work still. All right, then we have a three-letter word. A. So it could be AITS and twin A NTRE star. Excuse me. Of course, there might not even be a word that has three letters and then NTRE to begin with. In which case, I should expect to see no results. But no results. Dot 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 NTRE. Nope. Dot NTRE star. Quattro, C-O-I. Okay, that's not going to be a word like that. So maybe it's not T-Rexes. Maybe we just wait and see what goes in X's. But if we have STI, STI, it's got to be 3 letters. Stifle. Flen. Want it to end in O. Not much is working. Or not end in O, end in a vowel. So if I do it this way, let's see. Orbits is good. All right. Making progress. O R B I T S. Something begin with B R O. Oops. B R O R O N. Could have something like brony. Bronze is probably going to give me too much trouble. Too many. Again, too many weird letters. But it is possible to have something like, you know, Zal. But I think we're gonna running out of room to be cute. So maybe let's go with brony. I'm gonna try to something like taxes or maxes, mixes, and something ending in Y here. And then we again have the case of two. Oh, no, we'll have more flexibility there. We actually have enough that we can have 3 words that all come together in that area. I like that. So, let's see what. All right, sure. Let's just go with taxes. And I think what I want is, yeah. If we have, say, all right, I'm just sort of mapping this out now. 3-letter B, C, C, C. So what I'm thinking is that maybe we have a 6-letter word ending in UN or beginning NU, a 6-letter word ending ATY, and then a 5-letter word that's in the parts left over. So, and it doesn't have to be ATY, but that's what I have right now. So let's see. I have A is 2 letters, B is 1 letter, C is 3 letters. So if we have what was it? A, B, ATY, B, C, UN, twiddle A, twiddle B. Yes, I call a tilde a twiddle. I've been doing that since high school. No solutions, but maybe if we try some other possible arrangements, we also could go BA there. We could also have something other than AT. Okay, nothing that way. mixes. It may be that we want to 6 letters ending in UN might be the sticking point here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's not that many things there. 27. If we went around the other way, more. Okay, and actually what I'm going to do here is let's also put in D. All right, so let's back up to one of the queries that I had. All right, let's also add in D equals 2. So we need D XES. We want A, B, D, Y. We want B, let's just start with BCUN, and then twiddle A, twiddle B. There. Oh, wait. One problem here, that D needs to be reversed the second time. Oh, fix. That's a good one. Tux is on duty. Did I do that right? Oh, it's got to be AC here. Okay, right. Wrong duplication. That's why I had 3-letter words in there. Not a fan of those, but I have some room to play around, first with the directions that some of these words go, and secondly, I could go and play with the word lengths in the overlap, like which of the overlaps were longer. So I am holding out hope still. Maybe Cox's idiocy, nuclei, LCID. Those are reasonable entries. Nurse to Norse, but that's kind of really similar. Yeah, the problem is they're having on duty or unduly means I have also overlapping in the same place as the NU in under. Makes those very similar. So one other thing that I want to try here is, let's see. So if instead of being 6 letters up to there, that what if it's A and B? BA, that'll be Y, and now it's going to be CB, UN, and CA. Let's go with twiddle C, twiddle A, so that they're going in different directions. And if we get something good out of this, then I can throw up my hands and say, we're done. And of course, I get no results, because it's not going to be that easy. Fixes, gratify, tan gun. Don't like that. Menu, twiddle C. I don't really like ice run as a word. There's a couple of things I could do with changing some things. Changing the overlaps a little bit more. But if I want to make sure that everything is at least 7 letters, I could do something where instead of having A and B and C like this, where I have a 5-letter word going through A and C, I could just have a 6-letter word going around this whole that whole hexagon. It's allowable. I don't always like doing it. I usually don't like doing it. But I'm not proud or tired. That's a lie. I am getting tired. Let me just see if I had other. No, that's not good. And those were too short. Now, there's also the possibility I could have tried to change which ones are A's and which ones are C's in here, but really, like flipping those. Excuse me. You have the exact same wordplay constraints. If I tried doing A, and C. Basically, I could have. Excuse me, reflected the letters around this hexagon across a diagonal axis. I'm not going to do that. It is possible that I will just say that nurse and Norse is fine, or coxes and idiots. I mean, cox is, that's fine. Like coxswain is about 3 million. Do people actually say? I mean, if you just have coxswain rowing, okay, yeah, that's enough. Let's go with that. I'm not 100% thrilled with that as a situation, but so I'll go with CO, coxes, and then I had new N U C L E I, nuclei. Okay. I had over here, I had idiocy, which is again a word I'm not thrilled with, but in the interest of getting a finished puzzle here, I'll go with that. Y. And then, oh yeah, I also had the X and the E and the S checked over here. And then up here we have E checked. L, C. I hadn't yet checked that one, but now it is. D. Now, I appear to have everything checked, but I want to verify that. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to enter in all of the words that I have. Let me unmerge those. All right, so I have word length. And I'm just going to do these, enter these in without spaces. So, for example, under construction, and then let's do that in under construction, and length equals len that 17. And then up here, I will have equals sum of all the things in this column up to some amount. So right now, that's at 17. And I'm just going to add in every word that I have, which is one of the reasons why I want to keep track of the where every word starts, so that I can include that in the list. So under construction, nuclei active, LCID, idiocy, what was that? Vegetarian. It's good to spell things correctly, even if it's the same number of letters. Credit card. Coxes. Then over here, rated R. Oxi. What's that? G Gatorade. Orbits. What's in that? A atomic. E is email. Brony. Kurt C. Selling. Snail. Two things there. I might need to add more cells to keep the adding. Gnome. Wait, no. Oh, I missed a couple. No, I didn't. Gnome, the M was mingled. Oh, see, I've run out of things doing the adding, so I'll put those in. Or things keeping track of the lengths. So then at the C, I've got Cortado. And what was the other one that had the C? CR. Oh, Cro-Magnon. And then down here I've got model, intro, and niece. All right. And then sum, let me make sure that I've got everything in here at 27. Does that include everything? Yes. All right. So what I have here is it says that I have 168 letters in all of these. What I want to check this against is how many squares are, or how many blank cells are in this grid, and multiply by 2. I don't work with a 7-wide hexagon that often, but I can figure out how many there are. The easiest way to count this in a case like this is to just look at the 6 wedges. The central cell in this hexagon, which I will mark with, I don't know, percentage sign for the moment, that is going to be black. Occasionally, if you have a slightly less symmetric grid arrangement, it may be blank, but in this arrangement, it is black. So we then just look at 1/6 of the grid. And so that is going to be a triangle that is 6 hexagons on a side. That's going to be 21 hexagons, but some of them are black. So if we look at the ones that are black in, let's say, the upper triangle, and you have to be careful not to double count, since some of the some of them are on the edge. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, there are 7 black hexagons in that wedge, and there were 21 hexagons in the whole wedge. So 14 in that wedge times 6 is 84, times 2 is 168. So it looks like we in fact have the correct number of letters in all of these. And as we've been going along, it looks like they're all checked. So I am confident in saying that this is a correctly filled grid. It took a little longer than I was expecting. Usually it takes me somewhere between, if I'm working on an 8-wide hexagon, it will probably take me 90 minutes to an hour 90 minutes to 2 hours to fill if I am not being too ambitious and if I am not taking the time to explain my reasoning when I do weird things like this. But I hope this was educational and informative, and I hope that if you want to go and make your own hex pathfinders, you can. Before I finish, I want to talk about a couple of the differences between a hex pathfinder and a square pathfinder, aside from the fact that the grid shapes are different. So to illustrate, let me pull up, let me add a sheet that I'm going to make a square pathfinder grid on. Oops, let's make it a little bit more square than that. So typically I do my square pathfinders at 11 by 11 borders. And again, I'm going to, let's throw in the conditional formatting, excuse me, where if the text is a £, that the background becomes dark. So the pattern that I use for a square grid is every other square is black in every other row, but that they're staggered. So I do it like this. And in this case, you have, it's an 11 by 11 square grid, so there's 121 squares to start. I have blacked out 27 of those squares, so there are 94 blank squares remaining. There is a second arrangement that some people will do for this grid, which is slightly different. Basically, let's go ahead and remove these and do that and do that and add in the boundaries here and that. Add in the conditional formatting for this column as well. Let me make it dark there too. So sometimes people will do it shifted over one, but again, you have the issue where the corners are now again cut off, and you don't want to have that, so you fill in those as well. And this is the sort of thing that I said I didn't like to do in a hex grid, which is why I don't like to work with grids that are a multiple of 3. But a lot of constructors will use this as the arrangement. I prefer to use the left-hand arrangement. This does mean that you now have a total of 32 of the squares are black instead of just 27, so that there are, instead of 94, there are 89 blank squares. So you have fewer letters overall. You're probably going to have 1 or 2 fewer entries. If you've got over here your excuse me, if you've got your grid over here, the things to the so aside from the overall grid shape, I was talking about the traps when you're trying to finish a grid, areas that are difficult or perhaps impossible to fill in without without leaving unchecked squares. And this happens most often in a combination of 2 things. It happens near the edges especially when you have a confined area, and it happens especially when you have lots of squares that only connect to one other square, or to 2 other squares. For example, if you look at, let's put $signs in them, at these 4 squares at the top, and similarly the squares at the bottom, they, once you're getting up close to finishing that edge, those wind up being really constraining, that anything you put in them, in order to fit in them, you wind up either having to have really short words or really long words. Really short words, you don't want short words. Really long words are very constraining and hard to fit. And one of the reasons that these alleyways, as I like to call them, are constraining is if you've got, an answer, A, N, S, W. Once you start going in that alleyway, there's only one way it can go, and then you can change again. So you have fewer options while you're passing through there. And when you are getting into the area of having much of this, except for the top 3 rows or so, filled in, that constraint combined with the need to have all of the letters checked and have all of the words be at least 5 letters just becomes really difficult to work with. And so in a square grid, you have lots of squares that only have two neighbors, which means there's only one way for a word to go if it goes into that alley. So let me just sort of mark those. Pretty much everything on the edge, really. Well, at least on those parts of the edges. Like, I could go through and mark them all, but, somewhere around, I'm guessing half of the squares total in this grid only have 2 neighbors. And the rest have 3. Because in a square grid, you're going to have at most 4 neighbors, and the way that we've blacked out the squares, all of them have at least one of their neighbors blacked out. If we go into the hex grid, or if they don't have a neighbor blacked out, it's just not even in the grid to begin with. If we go to over here, let me go and fill in more of this. Actually, no, I'll make a copy of this. Oh, no, that's going to be a problem too. All right, I'll go back here. I'll fill in some more of the black squares, black hexes, until I have about half of the grid. So just looking at this top half, everything in this hex grid has 3 neighbors, except for the squares along the edge. Anything on the interior of this grid, proportionally more of the cells in this hex grid have been blacked out. 1 in every 3 square has been blacked out. In the square grid, 1 in every 4 was blacked out. But since hexagons have 6 neighbors to begin with, they still have more neighbors on average. The ones that don't have 3 neighbors are, again, around the outside, and that's it. And so, especially if you have a bigger grid, this was a 7 by 7, 7 on a side hexagon, and you could eventually see, well, we've got 4 on this side. So 24 out of the 84 cells in this hexagon have only 2 neighbors, compared to what would probably be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's 18, 22. Gonna be close to 40 out of these 94 squares in the square grid have only 2 neighbors. So it's a lot more constraining in that way. And so you don't have the problem of these alleys cutting you off. And so that extra freedom makes it much easier, I find, to fill these. I often get hung up about the average word length in a grid. And in the case of Square Pathfinder, I'm usually really happy if I can get it to about 7 letters. In a Hex Pathfinder, I can often get it a little bit longer. I don't have the numbers on hand to say, but usually if I'm doing a 8 on a side Hex Pathfinder, I can expect to have average word length be 7.2 to 7.5. So proportionally longer words, more interesting. I find that there's more interesting opportunities for overlaps because again, even when I'm not on the edge of the grid, anytime I pass through one of these alleyways, I have to keep going. There's nothing else I can do, and that often winds up cutting me off or having to be careful about what words I can put some in a place to avoid cutting off the squares from being checked. So, in short, I really recommend working with hex grids if you're doing Pathfinders. If you're doing Pathfinders at all, I recommend starting with a hex grid if that is a thing that is feasible for you to do in terms of having a grid available. In this particular case, let's see, we have a total of 25 words, 168 letters, so just shy of 7 per word, and I wasn't even really trying here. I tried to get some fun long words. I had a long word as the seed under construction. I had a few other long words like vegetarian and credit card, but most of the time I was just looking for words that fit. And I still had to fall back on more 5-letter words around the edges than I would like. And if I had more time, I would have tried to do some more planning to get fewer short words around the edges, which is, again, a thing that is very feasible to do on a hexagonal grid. So go, make hexes, be creative, have a good time with it. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you next time at Under Construction. Bye.